There might have been good and bad examples, but overall, weren't very efficient. In further attempts to raise revenue, tariff rates were increased. So you start getting this confluence of economic policies that don't look very good for growth at all. So there's a major recession in sub-Saharan Africa in starting 81, 82. And on top of that, we talked about this before, in 1983, 84, the largest drought to hit sub-Saharan Africa in the last couple hundred years hits at exactly that time. It's a drought that affects almost the whole continent, was incredibly severe. So it's just a terrible combination of events. By the mid-80s, African economies are just crumbling. Growth rates are negative everywhere, and there's an attempt to sort of rethink policy in that case. This was the sort of period in which Bates' arguments sort of got such a large audience and were so influential. He sort of gave a story for why we got here, which is related to really politics, political economy. Okay, any comments or thoughts? Are there any implications of this that we didn't spell out or you might think of? Do you have your hand up? No? Sorry, anytime anybody starts scratching, everybody's like afraid to scratch their head. If I see you going like this, I'm like, right over there. No, don't scratch. It'll be fine. It'll go away. This will like wait 10 seconds. It'll be fine. Yeah. Implications for trade? Well, clearly if over time everybody's smuggling their stuff out of the country, it's going to affect trade volumes from the source economy. If supply falls a lot, again, it's going to affect trade. So you have countries that should be agricultural exporters in the 80s now being net importers of a lot of food items that they should be exporting. So that was another puzzling result. Africa's a poor region. There's lots of land. The idea was they should be exporting agricultural products, not importing them. Yeah. Okay. This is really a great question. So we've been talking about the sort of low-income country piece of the puzzle. But I mentioned before, rich countries also subsidize their farmers. Rich countries subsidizing their farmers will tend to depress world prices. So everything else equal, if we pay our farmers to just grow tons of stuff, we're sort of flooding world markets with our products. That's going to undercut producers. It's going to tend to sort of reduce world prices. It'll be good for consumers everywhere. Consumers benefit. Like if we flood the world with grain, consumers everywhere benefit. Producers don't. So agricultural producers in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, low-income regions, again, we can debate which crop and whatnot, but in general, the producers will benefit from higher world prices. So there is a distributional consequence of our subsidies. I mentioned cotton in Tanzania. It's something that I learned about while I was working in Mayatu district. So 60% or 65% of farmers grow cotton. It's the main cash crop. There's like one factory in the district. It's a cotton processing plant. You basically need to process the cotton locally because it's too bulky to ship. So like the one bit of like proto-industrialization in the district is related to cotton, to agriculture. People there were just extremely bitter about all the subsidies that the U.S. government gives to cotton farmers. The U.S. heavily subsidizes cotton. It's fallen in recent years, but it was high. The Chinese government subsidizes their cotton farmers. So several big economies subsidize their cotton farmers, pushing down the world price, hurting farmers in Tanzania. Where that's the kind of the logical chain. Now, on top of all that, you have the country governments themselves squeezing their farmers yet further. So even with all the sort of, you could say, unfairness of global subsidy policy in agriculture, governments made it even worse through their marketing board policy. So I don't think we want to say it's one or the other. They were both contributing to African farmers getting very little money for their work on the farm. So what happened in the 1980s? There starts emerging a debate about where to go with economic policy. And a consensus that, at least among the IMF and the World Bank and a lot of high-level U.S. government officials and whatnot, that there needed to be some changes. So we'll talk about this debate today and then into the lecture on Thursday. The idea that gained a lot of traction really after about 1985 was that the big international donors should impose conditionality. Conditionality means imposing conditions, more conditions on lending, more stringent conditions on lending. In other words, if we believe Bob Bates' book, and we believe that these marketing boards are really the root cause, or one of the root causes of slow economic growth in Africa, they just distort this most important market in Africa, then maybe it's in the best interest of the citizens of Tanzania or Kenya or Ghana if the IMF and the World Bank say, hey, we're not going to lend you any more money, we're not going to provide foreign aid until you get rid of some of these conditions that we think are so bad for the economy. We're not just going to keep subsidizing your government to pursue these policies. Now, and again, we're going to talk about this. There's lots of pros and cons. So today and then the next lecture, I'm going to be kind of arguing one side, arguing the other, but of course it's up to you guys to think through what you think is right. Here's one of the cases for structural adjustment. The vast majority of African countries in the 1980s are not democracies. They're run by dictators, one-party states. They're not necessarily representing the interests of their citizens. The vast majority of their citizens are poor farmers, and they're taxing them at 60, 70%. And they're doing that to enrich themselves and their friends and rich people in urban areas. These are not governments whose policies reflect the interests or the needs of most citizens of their countries. There's not a democratic process. You can't say, well, the people of that country chose those policies, leave them alone. No, these were like almost every African country in the 80s was a dictatorship. So there was an argument among the donors to say, well, these policies have very little democratic legitimacy. They're bad for growth. They're bad for poor people. They're leading to deficits and inflation and all these terrible things. We're not going to bankroll it anymore. You don't have to take our money. Do whatever you want to do. But if you want our money, you have to stop these policies that we think are really damaging. That's the case for structural adjustment, or one of the cases for structural adjustment. And that's what this package of reforms was called. And the package is dismantling marketing boards, liberalizing other markets, ending subsidies for state enterprises, these state industrial enterprises, trying to cut back on bureaucracies, et cetera. Yeah, in the back. Before, I wouldn't say it was blank checks, but I think the idea was there were fewer stringent conditions. So not quite blank checks. It was a discussion about what might be a useful investment, et cetera. But at least in the popular imagination, yes, they were blank checks. And afterwards, there was conditionality. The Easterly chapter we're going to talk about suggests that maybe both of those are a little off. But from the point of view of like selling the structural adjustment story, yes. Beforehand, there were blank checks. Now we're going to have conditions. That's the story in the back. That is a very important question. It's an issue that comes up a lot. And I think whenever we look at U.S. or European policy towards low-income regions, we should have that question in our mind. How much is the policy we're pursuing just benefiting us? Maybe we use some other ideological justification, or we talk about helping poor people in poor countries or something. But at the end of the day, it's the sort of consistent factor that it benefits us. And here, there's, you can think of some rationales. If cocoa production and cotton production, all these things are really threatened globally because of agricultural policy in Africa, yeah, maybe the best thing for Western countries to get a stable supply of these goods is to let farmers get paid the world price and sort of maybe they'll produce more. So you could view it in that lens. I think there was also a real concern about political stability in this period. This was still the Cold War. Was there another hand up over here? Okay, Okay, so Easterly really talks about this. And in the last 15 minutes today, I'll get into this discussion, which will continue on Thursday. By the way, how many of you saw Easterly's talk last week? How many people showed up? How many people tried to show up but couldn't get in? There were a bunch of other people. Yeah, there were like 50 people turned away at the door or something like that. Okay, so what ends up happening? Starting in the 1980s, the World Bank and IMF start financing structural adjustment loans. And not just like one or two, tons of them. So starting in the 80s, the average African country over the next decade and a half gets 6 structural adjustment loans from the IMF or World Bank. 6 loans with very specific stringent conditions, like reform your agricultural sector. The average Latin American country got 5, the average Asian country got 4. So this was just a worldwide change in economic policy or foreign aid policy to impose a lot more conditions. I've talked about the potential upside to this in terms of helping the poor. There's a downside, which is to say, here all of a sudden, maybe with some of the concerns that were just raised in mind, there's a fear now that rich countries are basically just taking control of economic policy and social policy in poor countries. They're saying, hey, it's the 1980s, there's a huge global recession, foreign aid, foreign debt crisis, the debt crisis. The rich country donors basically have poor countries in a weakened position, and at exactly that moment, they're saying, hey, we'll give you your billions of dollars if you carry out all these reforms we like. Where the fear is, we like them because they benefit our companies. Or we like them because they are in line with our ideology. So the 1980s are also the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and kind of free market economic ideology is very prominent in public debates. And now all of a sudden, these same leaders of the US and the UK are going around saying, we're not going to lend to you guys until you adopt our policies, our free market policies. None of this regulated agricultural sector, free markets. So there's a very clear sort of left-right political divide in how people responded to structural adjustment. For folks more on the right, more into markets and more into what they would call economic liberty and whatnot, the case was clear. Liberalization's good. For folks more on the left, they said, wait a minute, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, maybe we can reform these institutions. We can regulate better. We can come up with better pricing policies. Why do we have to go all the way towards abolishing marketing boards? Why can't there be something in between? So this was an incredibly heated debate. Maybe if you guys have taken other development classes here at Berkeley or elsewhere, you've heard about sort of just how high profile this debate was in the 80s and the 90s. When I was a student in the early to mid-90s in undergrad, there was a movement that a bunch of student groups organized called 50 Years is Enough, that some groups I was affiliated with may or may not have been involved in. I won't comment on that. But basically, the World Bank and the IMF were founded in 1945, so the idea was in 1995, before you guys were born, that 50 years was enough. And the whole idea behind this sort of global movement was to say, was really born of the struggles over structural adjustment, saying, look, structural adjustment is not going to work. I think the counter argument to that is, at the time, no one knew whether it was going to work or not. There's more evidence now because more time has passed, but there was a lot of activism sort of on both sides. So these are the polar opposite views. The anti-structural adjustment view was it was callous and destructive. So, let's do radical reforms overnight, liberalize markets, change the structure of the economy, and that's going to lead to lots of displacement. One of the things that structural adjustment programs often called for were reductions in public employment, so public bureaucrats or government officials. So if it's 1985 or 1986 and countries are in recession, and farmers aren't doing well and workers aren't doing well, at least people with government jobs thought maybe they were doing okay, but even they were getting fired. So this had a lot of negative effects on them, potentially. There's a counterpoint about structural adjustment, and this is another thing that was raised, especially when growth rates didn't turn around immediately, which is maybe structural adjustment didn't go far enough. Maybe it was all for show. And Easterly's article sort of makes this case in his 2001 book. It's like they said they were doing structural adjustment. There was this huge debate, and all these students were protesting, and people were protesting in capitals, and structural adjustment has to stop. But at the end of the day, it wasn't even implemented. It was all just sort of rhetorical and political, but not reality. So why does Easterly say that? We'll come to that in a sec. But I just want to get started. Let's do another clicker question here. Before we get into all the details about some of the specific policies, I'm curious about your guys' views. Do you feel like these kinds of liberalizing reforms and getting rid of marketing boards and ending state-led industrialization, at the end of the day, now it's been almost 3 decades, did they lead to slower economic growth, in your view? Again, based on the limited amount we've discussed so far. We'll talk about it more. Did it not have much effect on growth? Were these a key reason for Africa's turnaround, actually, since 2000? Is it too hard to generalize, or is it still too soon to tell? You can talk to your neighbor if you guys want to discuss it. Okay. So we've got a real spread, which is interesting. Some people said they led to slower growth, much slower growth. A lot of people, they didn't have much effect. Some people said they were really important, or it's too heterogeneous, and others it's too soon to tell. So there's a lot of spread. I'm actually glad to see this because I think views on this are very polarized. And to be honest, if we look at the evidence, the data, it's very hard to get conclusive empirical evidence on the impacts of structural adjustment programs. Why is that? The countries that got the most structural adjustment were different than the countries that didn't. The countries with the worst economic crises, like Tanzania in the 1980s, sometimes had the most involvement by the World Bank and the IMF. So how can we separate the underlying economic problems from structural adjustment? It's not easy. It's not easy to do so. Okay, so what I want to do to continue here is talk about a case that has been the poster child, or talked about as the poster child of structural adjustment. One of the first countries to go through a structural adjustment program led by the World Bank. What's kind of neat about this case, especially reading Bill Easterly on this, is Easterly had just finished his PhD, and his first job at the bank was working on the Ghana structural adjustment project. So he went to Ghana, sort of involved in that, so he knows it really well, and it comes through a little bit in his book and also in some other work. So there's Ghana in West Africa. I've already mentioned it's a major cocoa producer. It was actually one of the first African countries to become independent in the independence wave after World War II. It became independent in 1957, so a few years before other countries. The first independence leader of Ghana was extremely charismatic and well-spoken and a great writer, Kwame Nkrumah, and he inspired a lot of people with a vision of Pan-African governance and African unity that was in some ways very similar to Nyerere, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. So at a lot of the early Pan-African conferences, Nyerere and Nkrumah were sort of off on one side calling for unity, and folks like Kenyatta and others were like, maybe not right now. So what happened in Ghana in the 1980s? Starting in the 80s, agricultural price controls were reduced. Marketing boards were downsized or disbanded. So the marketing board for cocoa was not disbanded, but it was downsized a lot. A lot of state bureaucrats were fired. These industrial sector workers in these state-owned factories were laid off. And a lot of the macroeconomic and international finance controls were loosened. So exchange rate controls were loosened, capital controls were loosened, price controls in agriculture were loosened. There was a lot of liberalization. Markets were allowed to function a lot better than they had for the previous couple decades, 20-something years. The Cocoa Board, which is called Cocoa Board in Ghana, which is another great name, fully lost its monopoly in '91. There were some reforms before then, and multiple buyers started entering the market. So after a while, there were almost a couple dozen buyers in there. It's pretty interesting to see what happened to staffing levels. Staffing levels in Cocoa Board fell by almost 80%. There were about 50,000 employees of the Cocoa Board in the 1980s, and it fell to like 10,000. So when we talk about sort of bloated state enterprises or organizations, this is what we're talking about. Organizations that can function with 80% fewer employees. Prices paid to farmers immediately went up dramatically when all these reforms happened. So cocoa farmers did a lot better under this regime than they had done under the old regime. Now, another thing that's helped Ghanaian cocoa farmers since then, although it's tragic, is there's been civil war and political instability in its neighboring country of Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire. And Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana have been the world's two largest cocoa producers for a long time. So with instability in Cote d'Ivoire, global prices went up, and Ghana benefited a lot from that. No, there wasn't a movement previous to this. Now, it might have happened anyway. Even without structural adjustment, governments may have realized that this was the right thing to do. We can never know. But these were reforms that were definitely pushed by the World Bank and the IMF, like directly pushed. There was a big focus on agricultural marketing boards. A, because it was a big sector, and B, Bates's book actually was like very widely read during this period. Martin? Inflation, definitely the early 80s. The early 80s were a period of economic collapse in Ghana, like many other African countries, and political instability. There was a coup, there was an elected regime overthrown, et cetera. So the early 80s were a period of instability, and starting around 85, 86, these reforms start getting implemented in Ghana. And by the early 90s, Ghana was being held up as a case, like a model case for structural adjustment. Yeah. Okay, the Ghanaian government was willing to cooperate early on. Again, there had been a coup. A former Air Force officer, Jerry Rawlings, came to power, and he basically agreed to work closely with the World Bank on these reforms. They had sort of a willing partner. In Tanzania, there was more hesitation because of the socialist history to kind of give it all up. And eventually they did, but they did it in smaller steps, and they did it more reluctantly, whereas the feeling was in Ghana, they kind of went for the reforms at that point. So Rawlings was much more pro-market, and that was part of the reason he embraced these reforms. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about Ghana and the Easterly article.